The chamber was cold the way it was always cold, not from any failure of the heating system, but because 17 species had argued for 17 years about what temperature counted as neutral, and the compromise had landed somewhere that satisfied no one and froze everyone equally. Nora Calloway sat in Earth's designated seat in the back row and thought about her coffee. It had gone cold 11 minutes ago. She knew this because she had been watching it the way a person watches something they are choosing not to do anything about. The cup sat on the table in front of her, ceramic, unremarkable, still giving off the ghost of steam. Around her, the chamber of accord hummed and clicked and breathed with the sound of 400 years of alien bureaucracy keeping itself alive. Speaker Olmveth was talking. He was almost always talking. He spoke in the way that very old, very careful creatures spoke, in circles that looked like lines, in statements that sounded like questions, in agreements that meant refusals. He had been doing this for 40 years. Nora had been listening for 14 of them. She smiled at him across the chamber floor. He smiled back. Neither smile meant anything, it looked like. Beside her, Lieutenant Danny Osei was writing. Danny was always writing. She wrote the way some people breathe, constantly, without thinking about it, as if stopping would be dangerous. Her stylus moved across the data pad in small, quick strokes. She had a gift for listening to alien bureaucrats say nothing and transcribing it with complete accuracy. The committee, Olmveth was saying, through his translator collar, has completed its procedural review of humanity's submitted trade route proposals, subsections 14 through 22, and has determined that additional review is required before a formal recommendation can be issued. Nora wrote nothing. She already knew what he was going to say before he said it. She had known for 6 years. This was the 214th consecutive session in which Earth's trade proposals had been sent back for additional review. The proposals themselves had not changed in 8 months. The committee that reviewed them had not changed its objections. It simply continued to require more review, in the way that a drain continues to require more water, endlessly, without progress, without conclusion. Danny passed her a data pad under the table. A new file had just come through on the Secure Earth channel. Nora took it without looking, held it flat against her knee, and kept her eyes on the chamber floor. Olmveth was still talking. 3 other speakers had requested the floor. Arbiter Seath, ancient and gray and quiet in his central chair, was watching the room the way old mountains watch weather. Nora looked down at the data pad. She read the file summary. She read it again. The document was called Resolution 7 Gamma. It had been filed 6 days ago, reviewed in closed session, and passed this morning by a vote of 14-3. It reclassified 11 of Earth's 17 outer colony worlds as uninhabited resource zones under conclave territorial law. The reclassification stripped Earth of legal claim to those worlds. Effectively, quietly, without announcement, without warning, the conclave had just taken 11 human colonies. In one document. On a Tuesday. Nora set the data pad on the table in front of her with the specific gentleness of someone who was choosing, very carefully and very deliberately, not to do something else with it. Danny's stylus stopped moving. Danny did not look at the data pad. She looked at the coffee cup. It had been 11 minutes. Nora had not touched it. In 6 years of working together, Danny had learned to read Nora the way sailors read water, by what wasn't moving rather than what was. The coffee cup was the tell. The coffee cup had never been wrong. Something had happened. Something large. Olmveth finished his statement and opened the floor to secondary speakers. A representative from the Thelk Union began a long procedural complaint about cargo corridor spacing. Nora listened without appearing to listen. This was another skill she had, the ability to seem present in a room while her mind was somewhere else entirely, moving through information the way a person moves through a building they know in the dark, no hesitation, no wasted steps. She was thinking about the 11 colonies. She knew all of them by name. She had visited 4. She knew the population counts, the resource outputs, the names of the lead administrators. She knew that Colony 7, officially designated EC-07, informally called New Decatur by the 30,000 people who lived there, had a school that had just been built with Earth-funded materials. She knew that Colony 12 had a water processing system that took 8 years and 4 budget cycles to approve. 30,000 people on Colony 7 alone. Multiply by 11. The math was not complicated. She picked up her coffee cup and drank what was left of it, cold, without changing her expression. She set it back down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at the chamber floor, where Olmveth was now nodding along to the Thelk representative's complaint with the polished attention of a creature who had perfected the art of looking like he cared. 40 years, she thought. He had been doing this for 40 years. Long before Nora. Long before the previous liaison, and the one before that. The Verith conclave had been slowly, carefully, procedurally shrinking Earth space in the conclave for 4 decades, and they had done it the same way you empty a room, one small thing at a time, nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like what it was. Dani leaned close. Her voice was barely a breath. How bad? Nora did not look at her. 11 colonies. Dani's stylus fell off the table. It hit the floor with a small, sharp sound. 3 nearby delegates glanced over. Dani picked it up. She straightened. She put her eyes back on her data pad and held them there and did not move her face into anything that could be read. Okay, Dani said, very quietly. It was not a response to new information. It was the sound of a person deciding to stay standing. Nora looked across the chamber at Speaker Olmveth. He was still talking. He was always talking. He was good at talking, at filling space with sound that looked like meaning, at making every conversation feel like it was going somewhere when it was in fact going nowhere, at being so perfectly, so surgically polite that the knife never showed. He had a gift. Nora had admired it once, in the early years, the way you admire a complicated machine even when it is working against you. She did not admire it now. She thought about the 48 procedural objections she was going to file tonight. She thought about the documentation she had been building for the past 6 years. She thought about the channel she was going to open after the session ended, the one that did not go to the conclave. She smiled at Olmveth across the room. He smiled back. Behind his eyes, she saw the very small flicker of something that was not quite confidence and not quite comfort. He thought he knew what her smile meant. He had thought that for 14 years. He was wrong. He had always been wrong. Dani was watching the coffee cup again. Nora had not ordered a second one. In 6 years, Nora always ordered a second coffee. Not tonight. The session ran another 2 hours. Nora sat through all of it. She took no notes. She filed no objections in the room. She did not raise her hand for the floor. She sat in Earth's back row seat in the cold chamber and she waited, with the particular stillness of a person who has already decided something and is simply finishing the day first. When the session ended and the chamber began to empty, she stood, gathered her things, and walked out without looking at Olmveth. He watched her go. For just a moment, one fraction of a moment, something moved behind his face that was not smugness and was not satisfaction. He did not know what to call it. He decided it was nothing. He was wrong about that too. The diplomatic suite was not large. It was the standard size that the conclave assigned to junior member species, which meant it had 3 rooms, 1 window that faced the station's interior cargo bay, and furniture that had been built for bodies that were not human. Nora had long since replaced the chairs with ones she'd brought from the ship. The desk was still wrong. She had never bothered fixing it. She filed the first objection at 11:14 in the evening, station time. She filed the last one at 4:50 in the morning. 48 total. Each one was different. Each one cited a different procedural violation embedded in the passage of Resolution 7 Gamma, a suppressed vote here, a quorum irregularity there, 3 instances of committee members voting on measures they had financial arrangements with, 1 case where a species representative had been quietly told what would happen to their trade access if they voted the wrong way. Nora had the documentation for all of it. She had been collecting it for 6 years, building it the way some people build walls, one careful piece at a time, always with an eye on what it would eventually hold up. She filed everything through proper channels. Every form had the correct headers. Every citation was formatted to conclave standards. Every diplomatic courtesy was included, right down to the closing salutations, which she wrote in each of the 14 primary conclave languages, correctly spelled. She had been preparing these objections for a long time. She had hoped she would never need to file them. Dani sat on the wrong furniture with her legs pulled under her and watched Nora work. She had offered to help 3 times. Nora had said no 3 times. Not unkindly, just the way you say no to someone handing you a tool you don't need. Danny understood. This was not the kind of work you shared. This was the kind of work that had to belong entirely to one person so that no one could later question the chain. At 2 in the morning, Danny made more coffee. At 2:15 she said, "Do you want to know what I keep thinking about?" Nora said, "No," and then, after a pause, "Yes." Danny looked at the window, at the cargo bay lights blinking slow and orange beyond the glass. "I grew up being told the conclave was this great thing. This huge achievement. 40 years of Earth being part of something bigger." She was quiet for a moment. "I joined the diplomatic corps because I believed that." Nora kept writing. "I still believe it," Danny said. "The idea of it. I think we were playing a game we didn't know the rules to. And they never told us the rules because the rules were the game." Nora looked up. She looked at Danny for a moment in the way she looked at things she thought were worth looking at. Then she said, "You know the rules now." Danny said, "Yeah." They did not say anything else about it. At 4 in the morning, Admiral Greg Harmon arrived. He did not knock loudly. He never knocked loudly. He had a specific knock, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more, that Nora had been recognizing since the early days when they were both on the same ship and knocking on each other's doors with mission problems and bad news, and occasionally, once or twice, with good news, which had always felt strange. She opened the door before the last tap finished. He came in, looked at the room, looked at the desk covered in filed objection records, looked at Danny on the wrong furniture, looked at the coffee. He picked up a cup, drank from it, made a face, and set it back down. "They done it, then," he said. "They done it," Nora said. He sat down across from her. He was a large man, Georgia-born, with the kind of stillness that came from 30 years of command, not the stillness of someone who had nothing to say, but the stillness of someone who had learned that most things did not require saying out loud. He had read the resolution on the shuttle over. She could tell by the way he held his shoulders. "Fleet's positioned," she asked. "Move this afternoon," he said. "Quiet. No noise." "Good." That was the entire conversation about the fleet. Neither of them said anything else about it. Danny, who was listening with both ears, filed it away and did not ask questions. At 4:50 Nora sent the last objection. She closed the filing system. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, not moving, looking at nothing in particular. "All 48?" Harmon asked. "All 48. He nodded once. "And you know what they'll do?" "Yes," she said. "I know what they'll do." She was not wrong. The formal acknowledgement came at 8 in the morning. It came as one document. It confirmed receipt of all 48 objections and stated that all 48 had been reviewed by the conclave's procedural committee and found to be without sufficient grounds for formal action. Reviewed and dismissed. All 48. In one document. Sent before she had filed number 20. Danny read the acknowledgement over Nora's shoulder. She read it twice. "They wrote the dismissal before you filed the objections." "Yes," Nora said. "So the whole thing, the objection process, it was never." "No," Nora said. "It was never." Danny sat down slowly in the wrong chair. She thought about the 4 years she had spent studying conclave diplomatic procedure in school. She thought about the professors who had taught it like it was a living thing, something real and breathing and fair. She felt the floor of a certain belief shift under her feet, not collapse, just shift, the way ground shifts before it decides what it's going to do next. Nora was not sitting down. She was standing at the window, looking at the cargo bay lights, which were still blinking slow and orange in the same rhythm they had blinked all night. "Ma'am," Danny said. "What do we do now?" Harmon answered before Nora could. "Now," he said, "she files." Danny looked at him. "Files what?" "They just dismissed everything." "Not with them," he said. Nora turned from the window. She opened a channel on her console, a different one Danny had not seen her use before. It did not route to the conclave. The header codes were different. The encryption was heavier. She sat down and began to write. Danny watched the console. The outgoing address was flagged with a routing tag she recognized from her third year of training, a tag that meant the message was going to multiple recipients simultaneously. Not 2 or 3. The routing tag was rated for up to 240 simultaneous sends. She looked at Nora. "How long have you been putting this together?" Nora said, without looking up, 6 years. Danny looked at the 48 filed objections on the desk. She looked at the dismissal notice. She looked at Nora. She thought, so the objections were never the move. They were the record. Proof, sitting in the official conclave archive forever, time-stamped, that Earth had tried. That Earth had asked through every proper channel and been refused every time. That when what came next came, whatever it was, no one could say Earth had not been patient. No one could say Earth had not tried. Nora finished writing. She reviewed the message once. She sent it. The console showed 212 successful sends. She closed the channel. She picked up the cold coffee. She drank it. She stood up. "Get some sleep," she said to both of them. "Session opens in 4 hours." Harmon said nothing. He finished his own coffee, stood, and left with the same quiet he had arrived with. Danny did not sleep. She sat in the wrong chair and looked at the window and thought about what it meant that the floor had been shifting this whole time and the humans in the room had known it and had been building anyway, not on the shifting ground, but on something under it. Something that had been patient, the way foundations are patient. The way deep water is patient. Still on the surface, moving underneath, going somewhere no one watching from above could see. She thought, they have been doing this for 6 years. She thought, and Olmveth has no idea. Outside, the cargo bay lights blinked on. Blinked off. Blinked on again. In 400 years of conclave history, no junior member species had ever called an emergency session. The rule existed on paper, technically available to all member species, the way emergency exits exist in buildings, everyone knows they're there, no one expects them to be used, and the moment someone uses one, the entire room realizes they had quietly assumed they never would. The notification went to all 17 member delegations at 6 in the morning. It was filed correctly, with all proper headers, in all 14 primary conclave languages, with the correct emergency session request code and the correct documentation of grounds. Everything about it was procedurally perfect. It was filed by Earth. Olmveth read it twice. Then he called his full delegation together in his suite and stood at the head of the table and said nothing for almost a full minute, which was, for him, the closest thing to visible alarm he was capable of producing. The session was set for noon. Nora arrived early. She walked in alone. No aide. No legal team. No documentation cases, no data pads, no equipment beyond the small personal device she carried on a cord around her neck, which she had carried at every session for 6 years and which no one had ever thought to ask about. She wore her standard diplomatic uniform, which was clean, pressed, and utterly unremarkable. She walked to Earth's designated seat in the back row, which the conclave had quietly relocated there 3 months ago, citing a seating arrangement revision that had affected no other delegation, and she sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. The chamber filled slowly. Other delegations arrived in clusters, which was unusual. Delegations did not normally cluster before sessions. They arrived in their own time, in their own order, took their seats, and the session began. Clustering was what happened when something had already started before the official start. Danny came in last, alone, and sat in the public observation section rather than at the Earth table. Nora had told her to. She did not explain why. Danny had learned not to need the explanation. Arbiter Seath arrived. He was the last to take his seat, as always. He moved slowly, not from weakness but from the particular slowness of something very old that has simply stopped being in a hurry. He sat in the central arbiter's chair and looked at the room. He looked at Nora. He looked at her for just a moment longer than he looked at anyone else. He said nothing. Olmveth called the session to order and then, with the smooth certainty of a creature who had run this room for decades, moved immediately to what he clearly intended as the first agenda item, the unauthorized repositioning of Earth's military fleet to proximity orbit around 3 conclave stations. He said unauthorized. He said it with the specific weight of someone laying a first card that they expected to end the game. Nora said, "I'd like to table that agenda item." The room went still. Tabling an agenda item was technically allowed. It was procedurally correct. It was also something that had never been done in the Chamber of Accord because agenda items were set by the presiding speaker, which was Olmveth, and no one had ever told Olmveth what was going on with his own agenda. He said, "The chair does not recognize." The chair is required to recognize emergency session requests from member species, Nora said. Under Conclave Procedural Code, Section 12, Article 4. I filed this session. I have the floor. The silence was different now. Denser. Like pressure building in a room with no windows. Olmveth said nothing. Nora said, "I'd like to address Resolution 7 Gamma." She did not ask for permission. She did not pause for acknowledgement. She simply began. She spoke the way someone reads a document they have memorized, not from memory, exactly, but from somewhere deeper than memory, from the part of a person where things they have lived with for years finally come out. She went through Resolution 7 Gamma from the beginning. She went through every vote. She named every procedural violation. She cited section numbers. She named dates. She named the conclave clerk who had altered the quorum record for the session in which the resolution was drafted. She named the 3 species delegations that had been told, in writing, what would happen to their cargo corridor access if they voted against the measure. She had the documents for all of it. She had the original altered quorum record and the unaltered version, side by side. She had the written communications to the 3 delegations. She had 6 years of similar communications, building a pattern so consistent that it had its own shape, its own fingerprint, the particular signature of an organization that had been doing the same thing for a very long time and had grown comfortable enough to stop hiding it carefully. She spoke for 22 minutes without stopping. No one interrupted her. This was not courtesy. Interrupting was normal in the Chamber of Accord. Species interrupted each other constantly, procedurally, diplomatically, with the correct forms and the correct signals. The room was silent not because they were being polite but because no one in it had yet found the place to put their response. The words were landing and the room was still trying to figure out what they were building. Danny, in the observation section, was watching Arbiter Seath. He had sat up straighter approximately 4 minutes into Nora's statement. He had not moved since then. His eyes were on Nora with the complete, unblinking attention of something ancient that has just seen something it did not expect to see, not frightened, not alarmed, but sharply, fully present in a way that suggested he was not often called on to be. When Nora finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Arbiter Seath said, "We request the documentation." Nora reached into her jacket and removed the small personal device on the cord around her neck. She set it on the table in front of her and slid it along the surface in the direction of the Arbiter's table. It traveled the length of Earth's back row desk, bumped gently against the edge, and stopped. One data pad. Smaller than a standard diplomatic document case. Lighter than anything in the room had any right to be. It contained everything. Organized by date. Cross-referenced by species involved. Indexed by violation type. 6 years of documentation, structured the way a person structures something they have been preparing for a long time and intend to be unmistakable. Seath's aide retrieved it. Seath looked at it without opening it yet. He looked at it the way you look at something when you already understand what it means but need a moment before the understanding becomes official. Olmveth said, "You cannot seriously intend to." He stopped. He stopped because Nora had looked at him. She had not moved. Her hands were still folded on the table. Her expression had not changed. She looked at him the way you look at something across a room that you have been patient with for a very long time, not with anger, not with triumph. With the complete, settled calm of a person who has already decided everything that needed deciding and is no longer in the process of deciding anything. It was not a threat. It was something harder than a threat. A threat is about what might happen. This look was about what had already happened and what that meant and the fact that all the time for other outcomes had, quietly and without announcement, run out. Olmveth had been in this room for 40 years. He had watched species come and go. He had learned to read rooms, read faces, read the specific frequencies of political discomfort and diplomatic uncertainty that told you where the power sat and what direction it was moving. He read Nora's face. He stopped talking. The chamber was very quiet. Somewhere in the ventilation system, something ticked. The cargo bay outside was running a shift change, lights were moving, dull and orange, beyond the station's outer panels. Arbiter Seath opened the data pad. He read the first page. He read the second. He did not look up. He made a note in his personal record, a small, careful note, the kind he had not made about any species in 11 years. He labeled it simply, observed. Danny, in the observation section, was very still. She had grown up believing the conclave was the greatest thing humanity had ever joined. She still believed in the idea of it, the huge, improbable idea that 40-odd species could share a room and make something work. But she understood now, watching Olmveth not speak and Seath read and Nora sit perfectly calm in the back row seat she had been quietly moved to 3 months ago, that the room had been wrong about something for a very long time. It had been wrong about the woman in the back row. It had looked at her patients and seen a ceiling. It had been looking at a floor the conclave called a recess at 2:17 in the afternoon. This was unusual. Emergency sessions did not typically break for recess. They ran until they reached a conclusion or until the presiding speaker called an adjournment, which was a different thing requiring different paperwork. A recess in the middle of an emergency session meant that someone, or several someones, needed to talk to each other in a room that was not this room. Olmveth left the chamber with 4 members of his delegation moving in a tight cluster behind him, the way debris moves behind something falling. Nora stayed in her seat. She did not check her console. She did not call anyone. She sat in the back row seat with her hands folded and watched the chamber empty the way you watch weather, without expectation, without hurry, noting what it did as it did it. Danny came down from the observation section and sat beside her. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "What do we do now?" Nora said, "We wait." Danny looked at the chamber doors through which Olmveth had disappeared. "Do you know what he's going to do?" "I know what his options are," Nora said. "I know which one he'll think is the best one. I know why he'll be wrong." Danny said, "Should I be scared?" Nora considered this. It was a real question and she gave it real consideration, which was the only kind of consideration she gave anything. "No," she said. "Not today." Danny nodded. She was not entirely reassured. She found, however, that she believed her. In his suite 3 corridors away, Olmveth was doing what he always did when things moved in directions he had not planned for. He was talking. He was very good at talking. He could, in the right conditions, talk a problem into a different shape, smooth it down, reframe it until it looked like something manageable. He had done this for 40 years. He had done it to problems considerably larger than a single human diplomat in a back row chair. The difficulty, he was discovering, was that this problem had already been given to people who were not in this room. The documentation Nora had presented, the data pad, the cross-referenced violations, the 6 years of collected communications, he had assumed, when she produced it, that it was intended for the chamber. For the session record. For the formal proceedings. It was not only for the chamber. He found this out when his communications officer reported, 20 minutes into the recess, that 12 independent system representatives had filed access requests for Earth's documentation package, which was already, as of 8 hours ago, publicly available through the Open Conclave record system, indexed and searchable, in all 14 primary conclave languages. She had released it before the session started. Before she walked into the room. Before she said a single word. Olmveth stood at his window and looked at the station exterior and thought, for the first time in a very long time, about the specific texture of a mistake that cannot be unmade. He had made mistakes before. Every creature who lived long enough made mistakes. The difference between a recoverable mistake and an unrecoverable one was usually time. If you had time, you could reshape things. If the mistake was already in the record, already in the system, already in the hands of 212 simultaneous recipients from the night before. He turned from the window. "What is the current status of the 3 species that voted with us on the resolution?" he asked. His communications officer checked her console. She said, "The Thelk Union has submitted a formal review request to the arbitration office. The Venn delegation has gone into internal session and is not responding to messages. The Rin Collective has formally requested Earth's legal counsel for assistance with a separate territorial matter." Olmveth said nothing. The Ring Collective had voted with his coalition on 14 consecutive measures. They had been a reliable part of his majority for 9 years. They had just asked Earth for legal help. Aboard the flagship of Earth's fleet, in standard orbit around Conclave Station Virith, Admiral Greg Harmon was drinking coffee. He was sitting in his command chair, which was the right size for a human body, because he had replaced the original 4 years ago with one he'd had made, and he was watching the station below through the forward viewport. The station was large and gray and full of 400 years of accumulated bureaucracy and alive in the way that things which have been running too long without inspection are alive, by momentum rather than intention. 17 human warships were in orbit with him. Not in formation. Not aggressive. Positioned the way you position things when you want them to be noticed without making a statement about being noticed, close enough to be present, far enough to be deniable, which meant not deniable at all, which was the point. His comms officer said, "Admiral, 3 Conclave species delegations have submitted formal requests. They're asking for Earth representation in separate territorial disputes." Harmon looked at his coffee. He said. He drank it. It was bad coffee. It was always bad coffee. He and Nora had been sharing the same terrible supplier for 20 years, through 3 postings and 2 promotions and 1 situation in the outer belt that neither of them had put fully in writing. He had never once complained about the coffee. Some things you kept because they were constant, and constancy was its own kind of comfort. "Log the requests," he said. "Forward to Commander Calloway." "Yes, sir." He went back to watching the station. In the diplomatic suite, Danny was the one watching the internal Conclave communication channels, which Earth should not have access to and which, she had recently discovered, Earth absolutely had access to and had had access to for longer than she had been alive. She was watching them the way you watch something you cannot quite believe is real, with the specific careful attention of a person trying to make sure they are reading it correctly. The channels were very busy. She said, to no one in particular, so that's what they were doing for 6 years. Nora, from across the room without looking up, filing paperwork. Danny stared at her. "That's not what I'd call it." "I know what you'd call it," Nora said. "I'm telling you what it was." At 4 in the afternoon, Speaker Olmveth sent a message to the Earth diplomatic suite requesting a private meeting. Nora read the message. She read it once, which was all it required. She filed a formal response. It was correct in every procedural detail. The headers were right, the format was right, the diplomatic courtesies were correct in all 14 Conclave languages. It cited procedural grounds, specifically Section 9, Article 7 of the Conclave's own Diplomatic Conduct Code, which stated that no active party to an open arbitration proceeding could request closed private meetings with opposing parties during the proceeding without prior arbiter approval. She declined the meeting. With his own rule. With a citation to the specific section of his own procedural code. She did not add anything to the message. No commentary. No explanation. No note about the irony. She simply filed it through proper channels, with the correct courtesies and the correct subject line, and sent it. Danny read the exchange over her shoulder. She made a small sound. "Was that," she started. "Procedurally correct?" Nora said. "Yes." "I was going to say something else," Danny said. "I know," Nora said. At 5:30, 3 delegations sent flowers to the Earth suite. This was an alien custom that some species used to signal a shift in relationship, not apology exactly, not alliance exactly, but a gesture that meant, we have reconsidered the position we were in, and we would like the person we are reconsidering it with to know that we know we are reconsidering it. Nora put them in a vase. She looked at the species names on the cards. She noted them. She filed them under a folder she had labeled, some years back, simply, useful to remember. Outside, in orbit, the fleet was still there. Still and quiet. Not threatening. Not moving. Just present. The way a fact is present. The way something is present when it has been decided and the only thing left is for everyone else in the room to finish understanding that the final session was set for 9 in the morning. The chamber filled the same way it always filled, species by species, delegation by delegation, the slow accumulation of bodies and customs and translator collars warming to active frequency. The lights were the same. The temperature was the same unsuccessful compromise it had always been. The procedural forms were in their usual places on the tables. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. Nora walked in and took her seat in the back row. She was alone again, no aide, no legal team. She had the small device on the cord around her neck, the same one she always wore, which was now empty because everything it had contained was already in the world, already in the public record, already in the hands of every independent system and neutral observer station in the quadrant. She had nothing left to deploy. She didn't need anything. The work was done. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Arbiter Seath arrived last, as always. He walked to his chair with the slowness of something that had outlasted every urgency it had ever encountered. He sat. He looked at the room. He looked at Nora. She met his eyes and held them for a moment, not as a challenge, just as acknowledgement. He had been the only creature in this room for 40 years who had watched everything and said nothing and waited to see what would happen. He had seen what had happened. He looked away first. He called the session to order. Olmveth stood to deliver the formal statement. He spoke in the consensus plural, as he always did. He used the long, careful structures that 4 decades of practiced diplomacy had built into the way he moved through language. He spoke about procedural review and mutual interest and the conclave's commitment to fair territorial arbitration. He used all the right words. He assembled them in all the right orders. He said that Resolution 7 Gamma had been reviewed in light of new procedural information and had been found to contain irregularities sufficient to require nullification. He said Earth's territorial claims were restored in full. He said this as if it were a decision the conclave had arrived at thoughtfully. As if it were the outcome of a careful, collaborative process. As if the fleet in orbit and the 212 recipients and the 3 species that had already switched sides and the public record that every independent system in the quadrant had now accessed were not the actual architecture of this moment. He delivered it like good news he had planned. No one in the room believed him. He knew no one believed him. He said it anyway, because this was the last tool he had left, the performance of normality, the assertion that this was a room where things happened for the stated reasons. Nora listened to the entire statement without changing her expression. When it was done, she said, "Noted. Thank you, Speaker." That was all. No triumph. No speech. No moment of visible satisfaction. She wrote something on her data pad with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to all paperwork, which to a room full of creatures that had been waiting for her to do something dramatic was somehow more unsettling than anything dramatic could have been. Danny, back in the observation section, let out a breath she had been holding since the previous morning. The session closed. Delegations rose. The chamber began, in its usual slow way, to empty. Seath did not leave immediately. He remained in his chair while the room cleared, the way someone stays in a theater after a film that gave them something to think about. He was very old. He had been in this room, or rooms like it, for longer than most of the species present had existed as spacefaring civilizations. He had watched 43 species end. He had watched others rise. He had watched alliances form and dissolve, wars start and stop, great gestures fail and small careful actions succeed. He had learned, over a very long time, that the moments history remembered were rarely the ones that looked large when they were happening. He was watching a small moment. He was watching it very carefully. When most of the room was clear, he stood. He moved toward the exit at his usual pace, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Nora was collecting her things at the back row table. He walked past 3 rows of empty seats and stopped where she was. She looked up. He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention he had been giving her since she had started speaking yesterday, the attention of something ancient that has just encountered a data point it did not have before and is adding it carefully to a very long record. He said, "You could have done this 20 years ago." Nora said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you?" She picked up her data pad. She considered the question the way she considered all things, directly, without performance, as if the honest answer were simply the most useful one available. She said, "We were hoping we wouldn't have to." She put the data pad under her arm. She nodded to him, once, the small precise nod that was her version of a deep bow. She walked out. He stood in the empty row and watched her go. He thought about the 43 species. He thought about what they had in common, not in the obvious ways that historians tended to note, but in the quiet ways, the structural ways. The assumptions they had all carried. The calculations they had all made about what was safe to take from something that had not yet shown them it was paying attention. None of them had made Nora's calculation. He made his second note of the session. He had made 2 notes in 2 days, which was more than he had made in the previous 11 years combined. Danny found Nora in the corridor outside the chamber, standing near the wall, looking at nothing in particular. Not lost, just still. Taking a moment, the way you take a moment after something long and heavy is finally set down. Danny stopped beside her. She did not say anything for a while. She was thinking about the girl she had been 4 years ago, sitting in a diplomatic training course being told about the conclave like it was a cathedral. She was thinking about the 48 objections filed into a system that had already written the dismissals. She was thinking about 6 years of documentation built in the margins of 14 years of smiling. She said, "Did we win?" Nora thought about the word. She used it carefully, the way she used everything, as if language were a tool that could do damage if applied wrong. She said, "We were always going to win." That was never the question. Danny said, "What was the question?" Nora said, "Whether we'd have to." They walked down the corridor. The station was busy at this hour, cargo movements, shift changes, the usual noise of something large and functional doing the work of keeping itself running. The lights in the corridor were the same pale institutional color they had always been. The floor was the same material, cold and slightly reflective. The translator signals from the nearby delegation suites made their usual low-frequency sound, like distant conversation heard through walls. Harmon was waiting near the docking bay. He had a thermos, the bad coffee, because he had brought the bad coffee, because 20 years of the bad coffee had become its own kind of language between them. He handed Nora a cup without being asked. She took it without saying thank you, because after 20 years the thank you was embedded in the taking. He said, "Done." She said, "Done." He said, "Fleets holding at orbit." "Say the word." She said, "Stand them down. Bring them back to standard position." He nodded. He did not ask her to define standard position. He knew what she meant. Far enough to be clearly not a threat. Close enough to be clearly remembered. He sent the order. His comms bracelet chimed once, confirming. Danny looked at the thermos in his hand. She said, "Is that the same supplier you've been using since?" "Yes," both of them said, at the same time. Danny looked at the ceiling. She said, "It's a terrible supplier." "Yes," they both said again. Somewhere behind them, in the chamber they had just left, a cleaning crew was already moving between the seats, collecting the procedural forms from the tables, resetting the room for the next session. They worked in the efficient, quiet way of people who do the same thing every day and have stopped noticing what happens in the room before they arrive. They would reset the tables. They would replace the forms. The chairs would go back to their places. The lights would stay the same pale institutional color. Everything would look like it had always looked. But in the room and outside it and in the system records and in the hands of 212 recipients across the quadrant, something had changed in the permanent, load-bearing way that things change when the truth of them finally becomes visible. Not loud. Not dramatic. The way a wall finally shows the crack that was always in it. In his private office on the far side of the station, Olmveth sat at his desk. He did not write anything. He did not call anyone. He sat with his hands on the desk and looked at the wall across from him. The wall was smooth and gray and entirely ordinary. He thought about how you think you know a room until the moment you discover you were sitting in someone else's room the entire time. He could not name what he felt. He had spent 40 years building a vocabulary for power, for getting it, using it, holding it, moving it around. He did not have words for this particular moment. He sat for a long time. In his notes that evening, in the long private journal he had kept for 4 decades, Arbiter Seath wrote one sentence about the humans. It was the first thing he had written about any species in 11 years. It read, "They are patient the way deep water is patient. Do not confuse stillness for shallowness." He looked at it. He underlined it. Then he underlined it again.